Be sure to check out MythVisionPodcast.com. Help MythVision grow, guys. Become a Patreon member. You guys will get early access to all my videos when I'm done editing them. Also, it's a small community where you guys can message me your questions and talk to me in private. You guys can also donate through PayPal and Cash App. Join the social media links down in the description. We have Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of social media. Help the community of MythVision grow. Hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you guys are notified every time I do a live video and you don't miss any of my content. All right, we are recording. No, I'm just kidding. 3, 2, we are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. I've got two monsters on this show today. You guys definitely want to check it out. Dr. Robert M. Price. You guys, I know he doesn't want me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. 2 PhDs, 3 master's degrees, and a bachelor's degree. Okay. He's a critical scholar, and critical scholarship is what he's best known for in the field that we talk about on MythVision, because he likes to critically analyze stuff and see what the truth is in the matter. James Stevens Valliant, author of Creating Christ and The Critics of Ayn Rand. For anyone who wants to check out the book, I think you really should, because it's a fascinating historical analysis of the contemporary political religious system going on in the first century among Jews as well as the Romans, and how they play out here is going to be suspiciously, I think, interesting today through this conversation with Dr. Price. So with that being said, James, I don't want to interfere, because this is going to be a show critically analyzing pros and cons too of your thesis of the Creating Christ idea, that there's a Roman provenance, that there is somewhere in the New Testament, you're not claiming 100% throughout the totality of it, that there is some top down. And for our audience who's watching, that is the idea that higher ups in the system of Rome, whether they be Jewish aristocrats or leaders of some sort, Herodian, Jews, whatever, and the collaboration of Rome are working in this text somehow, or in the movement somehow, to manipulate this movement in some way where it's radically different than the zealots, than the rebel factions, the people who are constantly fighting them. And so you're not saying it's not bottom up in some respects. You're not saying it's not bottoming up, but you're also definitely not saying it's not top down. It could be both. And so today I'm interested in seeing what that means. Bottom up, for those who don't know, that means it just naturally evolved from previous systems of religious movements, and it developed into what it is today. He believes that something interjected, something outside of this movement had its hands involved in making this movement become what it is. So with that being said, I'll step out of the way, James, if you'd like to go ahead and start asking away. And Dr. Bob, get your magnifying glass, brother, and work in it.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, Derek. As I was just saying earlier, in our discussion before, I think critical engagement in ideas is where knowledge really gets advanced. If someone brings up a criticism, it will either help me strengthen my argument, or it will show a flaw in my argument and have me rethink it. In either case, human knowledge is advanced, and I really think that it's that back and forth and asking for critical engagement from people who really know, like Dr. Price, is really critical in this. Yeah, the basic idea of creating Christ, and the one I think that gets most resistance actually, is this notion that there was some kind of artificial elbow in the road with the respect to the development of Messianic Judaism in the late 1st or early 2nd century. We have this cataclysmic set of conflicts between Jewish nationalists, militants, Messianic Jewish nationalists and militants in the first 2 centuries. And it seems to me that at least most of the New Testament, in one way or another, represents a critical reaction to that very form of Messianic Judaism. It's pro-peace, it's non-nationalistic, it's very frequently Torah critical, which is an underlying issue with the Jewish war. It appears that it's a systematic response, in fact, to all the basic tenets of the rebels of the first 2 centuries, the mainline Jewish messianics of the period. And one could almost say, well, look, if that's the case, then it either could be a natural, organic, as you put, reaction, or it could be something else, an intentional reaction to a specific ideology. And another thing that just strikes me from the 30,000-foot elevation is how sophisticated the Gospels are. Mark perhaps less so, and Matthew comes along to correct him, to correct his geography, his language, and theological matters that he disagrees with Mark about. But there's no question that each of the Gospels is reworking Hebrew scripture, details from Hebrew scripture in very sophisticated ways to make their theological or political points again and again and again. More than that, the gospel writers also appear to be influenced by pagan writing, by Plato, maybe Homer, maybe other classical writing. They're certainly taking on the form of classical biography, something that was actually a common thing at the time. Contemporary with the Gospels are ancient authors like Plutarch, right, and Suetonius, and they were very interested in this form of classical biography. And as fictitious as most of the Gospels are, I think, it's still nonetheless presented in this classical form. So whoever came up with the Gospels is a pretty sophisticated, educated person, probably Jewish. But as you point out, there were Jews working at the very highest level with Romans. The Emperor Titus, who sacked Jerusalem to fulfill Jesus' prophecy in Mark 13, was himself a messianic claimant, had very close Jewish associates. The nephew of the great Platonic Jewish philosopher Philo was there at his side at the siege of Jerusalem. Herodian princess and prince were there at his side at the siege of Jerusalem. Josephus, the historian, he says, was there at his side at the siege of Jerusalem. So we have highly educated, philosophically minded, historically minded, well-off Jews who are working with the Romans. And it's always struck me that given the level of sophistication, given the systematic nature of Christianity's response, New Testament Christianity's response to the Jewish rebel movement, that we have to be looking at people like that as our leading suspects for the New Testament. And that's the basic idea, at least from the 30,000-foot elevation.
That was beautifully put. Dr. Bob, what did you think of that? That was well put.
Yeah, I especially like the business about these Herodian members of Titus's entourage. I was just reading Frank Zindler's book, The Jesus the Jews Never Knew. And I read it years ago, and I was looking at it again. And he says, gee, everybody knows that Philo doesn't mention Jesus, even though he took a tour of Palestine and he was interested in the Essenes and described them, but nothing about a guy who walked on water and multiplied loaves and fishes and changed water into wine and healed the sick and exorcised demoniacs on every street corner. This didn't come to his attention. Well, that seems odd already, but he says, look, Paul is shown associating with, not in ideal circumstances, but associating with two of the, I think, nieces of Philo and Drusilla and Bernice. You mean to tell me he didn't have some way of finding out about Jesus and so on, if there was one? I hadn't really thought of that. And of course, this figures into the theory that Paul was Simon Magus, because Josephus associates Simon with the same circle of people as kind of a Rasputin on call by the royal elites, and Paul with them, Simon with them, the same guy. So that really is important. Plus, you got to keep in mind that the notion of a more pacified version of Jewish messianic belief was not something that would have to be imposed like forcibly, because the the rabbis and others after the fall of Jerusalem, and then after the whole thing happened again with Bar Kokhba, they said, look, let's leave it to God as to when he's going to send the Messiah. There's no way to know, so let's not jump the gun. You might want to be ready in case he comes. That's a different matter. But stop guessing when it's going to be. Of course, that's also one big reason we have in Mark 13 of that day and hour. No one knows, not even the Son. You want to head off this kind of crazy Harold Camping, Jehovah's Witness kind of anticipation. So that,
much less the guy with the sandwich board. The end is near.
Oh yeah, good old Ananias. Well, it was for him.
But these calculations from Daniel that informed certain first century Jews it was happening now, that's gone, and the Messiah becomes more spiritualized in Jewish literature, and certainly not an immediate concern. In effect, Rabbinic Judaism becomes much more of a Torah debating society than a nationalist movement expecting a political Messiah to come around the corner.
Yeah, they didn't have any political power either, since the Sanhedrin was transformed in the wake of these Roman conquests. And so it's not like, Rabbi Akiba was a big supporter of Simon Bar Kokhba and was ridiculed for it, but not excommunicated or anything, but he was martyred eventually. Well, that could happen, but again, it's after that point. C.K. Barrett thinks Gnosticism was a reaction to that you had, like you mentioned, spiritualizing the Messiah. This really jumped into a whole different realm to make the apocalyptic element not linear, sometime in the future, near or far, but the kingdom of God is up there in the pleroma. To dehistoricize it, that would make sense. But all of this goes to show that you wouldn't have to have Roman involvement for these things to happen. You could just say that Christians and Jews had learned their lesson. Like Reimarus already said, they had changed the face of Christianity once they realized the revolution wasn't going to work, but they didn't want to just drop it, so they changed it into a more, heavenly minded religion. But the thing is, two things, if you first posit that Rome could do what other empires that conquered Israel had done for hundreds of years, and impose a new version of religion on them to keep them quiet. One classic case being Zoroastrianism with Cyrus the Persian. This would be nothing out of character, not improbable, not implausible. Of course, that doesn't mean it happened, but then you take the second thing, like you point out with the numismatic and other evidence with the anchor and dolphins emblem that was especially beloved and used by the Flavians. Like, what is that doing in all these Christian places? And so there you have to say, well, I can't say that Rome wasn't involved. I mean, it seems like that means that there were Christians who understood that in some sense, the Flavian emperors were their patrons. And now not all Jewish Christians would have thought that even.
Right.
Hugh Schoenfield argued that the Jerusalem Christians were all zealots, basically, and that they made it tough for the other Jewish Christians who weren't. But that's why the Jews go to Gallio, I guess it is, and say, these guys are turning the world upside down. They're saying there's a different king, Jesus. That's just like when the Sadducees say to Pilate, this guy says there's another king, not Caesar. And so it makes sense that you would have that Christians would find themselves happily cooperating with sympathetic Romans. Like, you can't take the stereotype from the 1950s movies that all Romans hated Christians and Jews. There were, just like Judaism was popular, Nero's wife apparently converted to Judaism. Julia Domna, I think her name is, who was she Titus's sister or something like that? She apparently had a statue of Jesus alongside those of Orpheus and Apollonius of Tyana and so forth. It's and then we think there's reason.
Julia Domna was in the Severan reign dynasty at the beginning of the 3rd century.
Oh, later than I thought.
But still,
Way,
the combination there is startling. just to have a Roman imperial lady with that combination of idols is just a fascinating thing.
James, this is interesting what Bob's saying here, and I think this is a great point to ask this to kind of, I want to put some pressure on the thesis here. I think that we need to, because we're going to get critical. If we're going to iron sharpen iron here, we got to do this. It sounds like you're saying that, not saying it couldn't have even the emperor himself involved in some way, just like you mentioned back in Persia with Zoroastrianism, but that it didn't need to necessarily be that the Roman emperor himself, and I don't think you ever make that claim that the Roman emperor himself was necessarily involved, but that people who are up there with him are saying, look, he's not a bad person. Like, these aren't bad people. Like, we need to get along with our neighbor, whether they think he's bad or not. My point is that they're cooperating with the emperor and trying to find peace for their people. They think it's the best thing for their nation that they aren't fighting Rome, and that for their own religion to survive, and they're not going to go extinct. I mean, can you imagine being a Sadducee who doesn't believe in the resurrection? And
and there you bring up a good point. Mere self-preservation, and this has been when previously it's been pointed out that there are really pro-Roman political things that are just dropped like big bombs through the course of the New Testament. Romans 13, Jesus' centurion having more faith than any of the sons of Israel, really more faith than any contemporary Jew. So the normal explanation is that Christians were trying to get along with the Roman Empire. They wanted to avoid persecution. And so they, it was sort of a genuflection to the powers that be so that they could survive. That gets hard for me to understand. Dr. Bob made a really great point about this interaction between Jews and Romans. Josephus tells us about 1st century BC, 1st century CE Gentiles who were converted into Judaism, and he names them, the Herods, of course, were originally foreigners who were, but the royal Sedatia Beni, people who are marrying into the Herods, others. Then there are people from Jewish families, like one of Philo's nephews, who, according to Josephus, leaves the faith of his fathers, apparently is no longer at least a strict Jew. So you have this back and forth between the cultures. But that's not happening, let me suggest, among our ultra-conservative Jewish rebels. Those messianic rebels probably have a hardcore nationalist view of Messiah itself, which is what makes the combination of a messianic form of Judaism with this very pro-peace attitude that most of the New Testament exhibits paradoxical on the face of it. And it's that paradox. It's almost as though the messianic movement is being addressed in a negative, in a critically responsive way. In fact, the Gospels basically have the underlying theme. You Jews misunderstood the nature of Messiah as such. And so you didn't recognize Jesus when he came along, and you yelled, crucify him, crucify him. Which brings up another point. When you see that the underlying structure of all 4 Gospels in, say, the Passion narrative, the stuff they share, I know there's variations and differences, but the stuff they share, in every single version, he's betrayed by Judas. Pilate declares him innocent, point blank. Pilate is only convinced by the artificially thrice repeated demands of a crowd that looks like they might riot, like the rebels or something, that finally gets Pilate to yield. In Matthew's version, which is really curious because Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels. He's making Mark sound much more Jewish. And in fact, he's kind of coming off of the hardcore Pauline view of salvation by grace. But for all of Matthew's Jewish nature, he has the Jewish crowd say, in his version, his blood is on us and on our children. Now, one could look at Matthew and say, wow, what a psychologically shell-shocked reaction to the defeat at the hands of the Romans. You know, you could say maybe it's a, wow, you know, some kind of, Stockholm syndrome, people so blown away by the defeat. We must have been so wrong about the Messiah that we have to completely rechange, revamp, retool our understanding of Messiah. More along Pauline lines, if there was a Paul before the war. Now, or one could say that this is a self-conscious response that is systematically going after Jewish exceptionalism, Jewish militancy, Jewish nationalism, their conception of the Messiah, their Torah orthodoxy.
What do you think, Dr.
And
Von?
that strikes me. See, there's so much going on here. There's a bend. There's such a sharp elbow with New Testament literature. They are implicitly, if not explicitly, talking about a man God, something that is unprecedented in Hebrew thought and never repeated in Hebrew thought. Every offshoot of Judaism that I know of, there's only one example in which the Messiah is actually a man God, soon worshipped as the deity of the cult. Certainly by the 2nd century, that's what's going on. They're worshiping Jesus as a god. Now, that's a paradox in itself. Again, especially among culturally conservative, assimilation-resistant Messianic Jews who are our rebels. It's that paradoxical combination. It's the sudden, sweeping, and simultaneous nature of all the changes that Christianity is bringing to bear on Messianic Judaism of all things, that walking in the door makes me think that this is artificial in one sense. Someone has constructed, for example, the Passion narrative to blame the Jews for the death of Jesus, and perhaps to explain the defeat of the Jews in the Jewish war as a consequence. See, you crucified Jesus and you deserve what was coming. And when you look at Jesus's prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the false messiahs that are going to come, i.e. the rebel leaders, and the way it's fulfilled, it's really hard to miss that point, at least certainly in the synoptics. Geez, the Jewish people apparently were punished at the hands of God for misunderstanding their Messiah, killing their own Messiah by being defeated in the Jewish war. And that strikes me as requiring a lot of explanation. That's not a mere psychological, organic response within Judaism. Even if they were psychologically shell-shocked by the defeat, would they chuck in Jewish exceptionalism and allow everyone in like Paul seems to be doing? Would they be so Torah critical? And if you think about the systematic way the Jewish militancy is criticized in the New Testament, it's all of those things put together makes it hard to see that it's not in some way artificial and more than what could be explained by an organic development within Judaism. That I think we have with someone like Philo, who's really trying to blend Platonic and Stoic ideas with Judaism, or even some of the more mystical literature of the Jews. They're started to personify wisdom, Sophia. But still, even that isn't a God, man, is it? Christianity represents such a sharp bend in the road, and right at the time of the Jewish rebellion, and systematically addressing the rebel philosophy. That's what most persuades me by itself, that we're looking at something that was not entirely, at least, organic.
Well, the Deuteronomic so-called philosophy of history that dictated how Israelite and Jewish history was motivated and presented in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the idea that it's like an elaborate theodicy scheme. You've got to say, well, according to the provisions of the covenant in the Pentateuch, you'd think God would be on our side, but then how come all this stuff happened to us? And so they said, well, it must be our fault. I mean, it couldn't be God's fault. What does he just, does he, like Woody Allen's fictive rabbi, say the covenant was just mere chin music? No, it must have been our fault. We must have done.
That's a great point. You know, Jewish monotheism sort of implies a guilt. God can't be rewarding these polytheistic foreigners. We must have let God down by breaking the covenant.
Yeah, like in Second Maccabees, when you have the seven brothers who won't give in to Antiochus Epiphanes and are horribly tortured. I mean, it's amazing the graphic detail in that book. They say, well, the narrator pauses and says to the reader, now you may think this is unfair of God, but why isn't he punished if he allowed these villains to martyr these people? Why isn't he lowering the boom on them rather than us? And he says, well, you see, God has given them enough rope to hang themselves. They'll get it in the afterlife, but we won't, because we've already had the hell persecuted out of us here. And so there again, you have to get God off the hook. And if that means, well, we must have done something wrong. It reminds me of a Saturday Night Live skit that I love from the 80s, where Kevin Nealon is the dad. He and his wife are there with their kids on Christmas morning, and there are no presents under the tree. And the dad says, well, kids, I guess we just weren't good enough this past year to deserve it. I don't know what we did wrong, but we're really going to have to, like, he's never grown up out of this. And he says, we must have done something wrong. Let's really try to be good, nice, not naughty this coming year. And the police are there who assumed that they had presents that were stolen. They're looking at these people like, what is going on here? Well, that's kind of the way the Deuteronomic philosophy of history was. I'm not sure what we did. It's like Job, who won't hear of what his comforters, Larry, Moe, and Curly, are telling him, that, come on, Job, you must have done something wrong.
I would contrast, however, what happened at the fall of the first temple and the return and the building of the second temple with what we're seeing with Christianity. In the prophets, when Hosea complains that Israel has sinned and they're going to get it, and Jeremiah complains they're going to get it in Jerusalem, what they're talking about is Torah orthodoxy not being lived up to. In other words, we broke the covenant, and see, I can prove we broke the covenant here because we were idol worshipers and so forth and so on, married foreign women and so forth. And then when they come back from exile, Ezra and Nehemiah are not anti-nationalist, are not anti-exceptional, Jewish exceptionalists, quite the opposite. Again, it's a call to Torah orthodoxy, and it's a call to a renewed kind of nationalism and Jewish exceptionalism. In those respects, Christianity is a very distinct sort of solution. The solution that Christianity is offering is not, you guys weren't Torah orthodox enough. The solution is not, well, we really got to dig in with nationalism and exceptionalism and militancy. I mean, Ezra and Nehemiah are almost the most racist parts of the Hebrew scripture. It's us and only us. And even if you marry foreigners, get those Benjamites out who've married foreigners. It's a very different kind of response than we see in Christianity. It is actually going back to the covenant, which we must have allegedly broken, and said we have to get right with that. We have to get more Torah orthodox. We have to dig in our holes, our shoes deeper into the idea of Jewish exceptionalism. Rather than less. It seems to me, again, the complete taking out of Jewish exceptionalism that you basically see in Paul, and the development of increasing anti-Semitism through the documents until you get to like John, the Johannine literature, which is really anti-Semitic as well. What you're seeing is not we're still God's special people, and therefore we're better because we're going to obey Torah all the more, but a Torah critical, and even more, one that gets rid of Jewish exceptionalism at the root. And I find those problematic in the sense that it's not like the previous explanation of how we sinned and got punished and the first temple was destroyed. This time, the second temple is destroyed. And it doesn't have to do with our lack of Torah orthodoxy. No, in fact, it has to do with our sectarianism, our misunderstanding of the military and political nature of Messiah. It's a very different sort of political response, and a political response almost on the face of it.
Well, Matthew does have the idea that though he doesn't disagree with the teaching of the Pharisees, they're not very righteous. Your righteousness has to exceed theirs. So he may be setting the table for saying, had they been more faithful to the Torah, because Matthew certainly likes the Torah, this wouldn't have happened. And he must combined with that, the idea of rejecting the true Messiah. The moment where he says, where Matthew has the crowd say, yeah, that's Pilate washes his hands and it says, this is on you. I had nothing to do with it. And he says, it's okay. Let his blood be on us and on our children. Why does he say that? Well, because he wants to give time for another 40 years for the temple to be destroyed. It's not going to happen immediately, but in the day of our children, it will be. But I think there's like a double entendre there. You know, when John has, is it Caiaphas? I can't keep the two guys straight. Say that. Can't you see, he says to the Sanhedrin, that it's better for us in the long run if one man dies rather than the whole people? And he says, well, he was a prophet and he was saying more than he knew. I think that's going on in this too, because the wording of the crowd's response in Matthew seems to recall what Moses says to the Israelites when he's got the covenant there, and he says, and he sprinkles the sacrificial blood on it and on them, on the Israelites, and says, behold the blood of the covenant. And so I have a hunch there's the double entendre in exactly the same way that the new covenant is being initiated with Jews. But for those who have disqualified themselves, you know, Hannah bar the door. Or Kate.
The thing about Matthew and Torah is a really interesting one, because I think the issue is a very complex one. There's no question in my mind, and I think in most scholars' minds, that Matthew is not satisfied with Mark. He is trying to defend a more Jewish way. We can even see when he's saying it's not Paul's notion of pure grace, but works and grace, sort of a combination. He is retrenching, re-Judaizing what he sees, I think, as definitely anti-Torah aspects in Paul and Mark. He wants to re-Judaize and come back, take a step back towards Jewish law and Torah. On the other hand, we have all kinds of material in Matthew. Well, first, Matthew is keying off of Mark. Why would Matthew key off of Mark at all in the first place if his orientation was like, say, James and Cephas, Paul's opponents in Galatians? If he was really strict about Torah, it seems to me he wouldn't have keyed off Mark at all. He would have left, forget Mark. I got a whole new story. And more than that, it's like certain parts of Jesus's Obiter Dicta, and again, with all due respect to Dr. Goodacre, I do think there was a cue, not just Matthew. I can get into that later. But he does appear to be softening some of the anti-Torah language that he's inherited. Like, it's not what you put into your body that defiles, but what comes out. We'll go on to say, well, it's really a washing your hands complaint. But you notice, it's still a Jewish purity complaint. Even Matthew is aware that we're not hardcore Torah orthodox.
And he cuts Mark's comment. Thus he declared all foods clean. Get out there.
Right. No. He is not going that far.
Mark has the so-called passage about the strange exorcist, as if there was any other kind. And in it, James and John say, hey, Master, you're going to be proud of us. We saw some guy working our side of the street, casting out demons in your name, so we told him to cease and desist. And Jesus says, you did what? He's doing a miracle in my name, and you told him to stop. Look, we need all the friends we can get. Sorry, because whoever's not against me is for me. Well, that suspiciously drops out of Matthew. We don't find it there, right. But we do have a scene where Paul shows up at the pearly gates at the when the kingdom of God arrives and says, "Hey, open up! Don't you remember the good old days when I preached the gospel and cast out demons in your name?" I'm sorry, I don't see your name on the list. And no, it's got to be there. And he says, "Get out of here, you workers of anomia." Not just wickedness, but you're against the nomos, the Torah, and that's got to be Paul. And I think probably the strange exorcist in Mark was too. And so you have these different notions, and this is especially true because I think you may be interpreting Paul in terms of Lutheranism, which everybody did until recently, because I think you can make a better argument that when he says you're not saved by works, he means works of the Torah, meaning stipulated ritual or ceremonial markers like circumcision, kosher laws, holy days, and all of that. And that is really, I mean, if that's what he's talking about, you can see why Matthew doesn't like him. Matthew's not going to quibble.
Oh, and I think I agree with you. There's clear Paul has a conception of virtue, and he tells us what he expects virtuous people to be like. But when he says it's not works, I think he means works of, specifically works of the Jewish Torah that are unique to Judaism, the stuff he takes on, like kosher diet and circumcision.
So let me ask a question, if you don't mind. I think this is an important question to ask. I try not to interject, but Dr. Price, in light of the theory, the Roman provenance theory, that Rome may play a role somehow in the New Testament, we know it plays a role in history. I mean, it becomes the legal religion of Rome. I mean, this thing becomes that religion. But is there a hand, in your guesstimation, looking at this theory, is there a possible foreign, and when I say foreign, I mean non-Jewish, influence in the New Testament maybe? Does it all have to be ground up? Is it possible that there is a foreign interjection, that elbow that James is talking about? Do you think that high up Jews that are collaborating with Rome are kind of taking it back to the messianists that are not a good example for the national existence of this nation or continuation of Jews? In fact, so much so that they're collaborating to a point where Jew and Gentile are equal. I mean, there's no more we're special people. We're all special in Christ. So what the heck? That seems radical to me. Like, that doesn't even seem like it's almost, I mean, I'm not gonna say a Jew couldn't come up with it. It just is so radical to say that Jews are not necessarily this.
If I could just amplify that.
Yeah.
Dr. Bob was making a great point. It's clear that Matthew is trying to come off of Paul and Mark's total Torah criticism, softening that, saying, no. We're not necessarily taking on the whole of Torah. But you really do see interesting things even in Matthew, where, for example, with the centurion, he's saying, it's clear that it's we're not talking about a Jew, because Jesus then proceeds to have a big lecture about how many nations will come sit at the feast table with Abraham, but for the Jews there'll be much suffering and gnashing of teeth. What's going on there is, it's true, there's still something special about the Jewish people, even in Matthew, the most Jewish of Gospels, but it's not altogether clear. Like I say, he's still keying off Mark. He's still keying off of this Torah critical tradition that began with Paul, perhaps, and certainly goes into with Mark. And what he's doing is he's softening the Torah criticism, but nonetheless having a lot of this open the door to everybody stuff. Jesus's Great Commission to the disciples. Now you could think, okay, are these lost Israelites like our IO friends? But the Great Commission is very clear. All the nations of the world have to get it. So if I could just amplify that, it does seem that all of the Gospels, in effect, are doing something different. And the other big one is a man God. Certainly by John, there's no question we're talking about a deity, not some spiritual angelic force anymore at a minimum. But it seems to me that Paul's mystery God, and even implicitly in the synoptics, we're talking about a God-man, entirely unprecedented within Judaism. How organic really is that? And isn't that a result of certain foreign influences?
It's hard to say, because there are several miraculous conceptions in the Old Testament, and in the Gospels, even another one with John the Baptist, that the woman is perceived to be barren and can't have kids, and so she prays, and an angel of Yahweh appears, and then she's able to do it, and that implies that, like, we're not told what happened to her physiologically, that she was able to bear children, but it might easily imply that there was no human father involved. I mean, it could mean that there was, and the seed finally found purchase in the womb. It could. It just doesn't say. There was a rabbinic tradition that Moses might have been directly begotten by God and not by his legal father, because I was just reading about this recently, that something in the Hebrew, one of the passages, I forget what it was now, but that given the fact that Moses' father didn't want to have kids because he'd only have to dunk them in the river, that if Moses was to be born at all, God had to take a hand. And so some Jews apparently thought Moses was miraculously conceived, which without a human father. Not the general belief, but there were many beliefs. And even if you discount that, the thing with Mary is not hugely different from Isaac and Samson and Samuel and John the Baptist, because Jesus is not the result of a regular conception. So it may not be all that different. But then on the other hand, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is some book of Noah, or a fragment of it, where he in the cradle appears to be superhuman, and his complexion, his eyes and so forth, and it's like he's one of the Nephilim or something. And this was again not orthodoxy, but nothing was yet. I think all of those stories, like of Isaac and the others begetting, I think originally the point was that the angel of Yahweh, who pretty much is Yahweh, like, have I really seen him and survived it? That he impregnated the women. They just don't want to say that explicitly. So it may not have been that unusual, really, in Jewish thought. They might have picked it up from the Gentiles, but they knew there were demigods. They knew about Gilgamesh, who's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They may have known, well, it seems like, yeah, they knew about Hercules, who was a demigod. There's a mosaic picture of him in the Dura Europa synagogue, and so on. I guess he must.
Insofar as Paul, at least some of the Pauline material, whether it's later interpolated or we could talk about, but some of the Pauline material, and certainly the beginning of John, has Jesus as a pre-existent being there with God at the creation, indeed an agent of the very creation of the universe. Doesn't that sort of put him at a different level than a human?
Well, yeah, and you have stuff like that said in Philo, and people debate over how allegorical he was getting, but he said Moses and Isaac and others were the Logos. Does he mean they stand for that in the story? They're symbols of it, or that they themselves were somehow embodied incarnations? And it's not clear to me that he doesn't think the latter. Also, apparently in First Enoch, Enoch was there from the beginning of the world as the Son of Man, and
right, that's really clear.
Forgotten it, and then it's revealed to him.
Yeah, Enoch is a really clear case of pre-existent. Yeah,
and
the others I'm not so convinced about, but Enoch, you're absolutely right. The implication is he's a pre-existent being. Yeah, that's interesting. So even the idea of a pre-existent being there with God could still make him just a really high angelic force in your mind, and not necessarily yet pagan influenced
Right.
The other
Because a
thing
lot
is
of
that
these mythemes were just in the air, like the
right.
sons of God and daughters of men in Genesis 6, who gave rise to the mighty men of old. In other words, Gilgamesh, Hercules, Samson, and so forth. So it's hard to segregate this stuff completely. However, well, you
Had
find
there
that,
ever been a conception of the Messiah as a spiritual being? I guess in the sense of Moses being or Enoch being, we were already there. But normally the messianic expectation is for someone like the Maccabees to come along, or someone like a David to come along, right? And it's not generally thought that someone like David or the Maccabees, met messiahs though they may have been, are angelic beings, or the incarnation of angelic beings.
well, the way this is also hotly debated, but the sacred king mythology that was shared with Babylon and the Canaanite states and so on,
Yeah, many
said
Near
that the
Eastern
king
religions.
was he was the vicar of the king of the gods on earth and could be addressed as God, as every king is in a couple of psalms, and so. Was that purely honorific, or did they think he had become divine? And I don't know that there's any way to be sure, but like Martin Note, a radical sort of Old Testament equivalent to Bultmann, he said, "Oh no, they didn't believe that the king can be by nature divine." I'm not so sure of that. I think the Scandinavian school, like Mowinckel and these guys, I think they were more open to the idea that the kings were really divine, and so supposedly was the king of Babylon and so on.
These
So
pagan kings clearly saw themselves as god kings. Yeah. Well, do we have some parallel with the suffering, resurrecting deities like Osiris or Serapis or Asclepius, Attis? We have a whole Dionysus. We have a whole range of demigods who are sort of, or gods in the case of Osiris, who are being martyred, in the case of Osiris, torn into bits, and then resurrected. And in the case of Osiris and Serapis and maybe Dionysus, and certainly the Orphics, that resurrection experience is connected to the hopes of the devotee for an afterlife or a better afterlife, depending on how you look. Either it's, you just come to an end or you suffer. But in any event, afterlife or a better afterlife is modeled by the suffering, resurrection, and apotheosis of the pagan deity.
That's right, and that was first applied again to the sacred king. Like in Egypt, the pharaoh was the one who had become Osiris and or Horus, but by the time the pyramid texts were written, which is older than the Old Testament, it says about whoever's buried here, as Osiris rose, so-and-so will rise. And so they democratized it eventually. So exactly that happened. And
we know that's happening with the Orphics and maybe Dionysians too, according to the inscriptions we have.
Think of all the people named for Dionysus. Everybody named Dionysius is... like Dennis the Menace is actually named for the god Dionysus, and his devotees were being identified with him.
So do you see a pagan influence there that we don't see elsewhere? A suffering, resurrecting man god whose apotheosis is the path, is the model for his devotees' better afterlife?
Well, all of these guys that, like, originally, the sacred king thing was about the renewal of nature every year, and the king was the substitute for the god. Eventually, when people from all over the empire began moving around all over the place, to maintain their ethnic identity, they would join what are now mystery cults. They had been mystery religions because they were the organic religion of a culture. But now here you are stuck in the middle of Rome or somewhere with all sorts of people. And so it's like having a Slavonic hall or a black student union or something. And so this was the way to maintain your ethnicity. And it wasn't about fertilizing the fields anymore. So what was it about? Well, they changed it over to a rebirth rite of passage, only now instead of like traditionally a rite of passage from adolescence to adulthood involved marriageability, sometimes bridegroom circumcision, a ritual of death and resurrection, or killing an enemy or an animal, and learning the secrets of the sacred, of the religion that only adults knew. Well, they seem to have expanded that to where you learn stuff that even the most adults did not know, because you have now been united with a God. And Christians in Syria had a rite like that. The Valentinian Gnostics did too.
Right.
Where you went into the bridal chamber, where you encountered your higher self, the resurrected Christ.
But this sounds like pagan rituals. This sounds like an Eleusinian mystery, or the Torah Bolum, where the blood of the bull would be, the slaughter of the bull above you, and all the warm blood you'd be baptized in effect in the warm blood in the great goddess worship. You'd have this transformative experience. Is there something similar to that in Judaism before this? That is to say, a model of this kind. They had a view, at least certain views had a view of resurrection, but did they ever have a view of resurrection that would take a Messiah's model of death, resurrection, and apotheosis, like in the Osiris case, in the Jewish context?
Well, the sacred king had to repeat the defeat of the chaos dragon, which was apparently a kind of costumed dance with a bunch of guys in a dragon suit, like a Chinese New Year parade. But in the Enuma Elish with Marduk, he enacts the thing, and there's what looks like a kind of a redacted gap where other versions of the Marduk triumph myth have him killed and devoured by the dragon, and then he fights his way out, disemboweling Tiamat, and that's the death and resurrection.
That would be hearkening back to ancient roots that may have influenced Judaism. Is there anything like that in Second Temple type of post-Ezra, Nehemiah type Judaism?
Romulus is a case of that, where he was apparently killed on the battlefield, or instead of being killed, which kind of comes to the same thing, he ascended into heaven, and some people claim they saw it, and now he was a god. And then
a god, Canarius, right? A totally different name and everything. Yeah, but that's again a pagan context. Is there anything in Second Temple Judaism, as opposed to say maybe ancient Jewish roots, that would be a precedent for a resurrecting Messiah being the model?
I think so, because as Margaret Barker points out, there are various signs that these pre-Deuteronomic mythemes and such were not forgotten. It was like traditionalist Catholics after Vatican II. They said, look, I'm not doing this. I'm sticking with what I always did. No meat on Fridays, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been schisms because of it. Same thing with Farrakhan with the Nation of Islam. Once Elijah Muhammad died and his son Warith Deen Muhammad took over, he changed the religion. Well, a lot of people didn't like it, and so Farrakhan said, nope, we're going back to the old ways. Well, that Barker shows how that apparently happened in Israel, in Judea, that Philo, various Gnostics, and others retained these old things, like Dame Wisdom was really Astarte. And think of how Leviathan, the seven-headed dragon, pops up in Revelation, and so on. It seems to me like Daniel Boyarin, he's the only one I've read that realized this. He said the elements of the old sacred king myth survived and provided the template for the earlier doctrine of the Messiah. Well, I don't mean that. I mean, the one they tried to suppress with the Deuteronomic reform. That's when the Messiah just became a descendant of David and a righteous king. Okay, he might live for centuries miraculously.
You're saying that could have been organically revived in the first century?
Yeah, or just it never stopped.
Never really stopped in some corners, right?
Because people didn't rediscover Leviathan. They must have known who the reference was in the Psalms and Isaiah about the serpent, Rahab and Leviathan and so on, with the thou who crushest the heads of Leviathan on the waters, all this stuff. I would assume it was the same thing with the sacred king mythology, and that's what, I mean, it conforms so much to Christian Christology. They inherited it from rationalized Pharisaic and later rabbinic Judaism that couldn't have God kings because they were now monotheists. But there were still plenty of people in Israel who were polytheists, like in Second Maccabees.
Effectively polytheists.
Well, even avowedly. Remember in Second Maccabees, after a battle against the Seleucids, this is why Martin Luther didn't want Second Maccabees in the canon.
Right.
I'm sorry.
I was just saying, right, yeah. Martin Luther didn't like that implication of Maccabees.
And one big reason was they were picking up the slain bodies of the heroes of Judaism, and they found that some of them were wearing protective amulets, which apparently didn't work too well, showing the gods of Jaffa mentioned in the New Testament. What the hell?
Yeah.
They're fighting against a guy trying to impose pagan monotheism on the Jews, and they're polytheists.
Right.
And they prayed for him anyway, and it says that's why it's not a bad idea to pray for the dead. Well,
let me ask you this then. Yeah, do you see anything is the equivalent? So at least it's conceivable that this notion of a resurrected figure could serve as a model for the afterlife of the Jew. And there certainly is criticism. Obviously, there's a debate within early Christian communities, too. Why are you calling me good? No one's good but God. I mean, we find that stuff in there, too. Right. So there's clearly at least a debate over Jesus's divinity going on in there. No question. The sweeping critique of Torah that we find in Paul and implicitly in some of the Gospels. I mean, it's clear that kosher diet and circumcision are no longer necessary. And really quickly, Christians lose just about every other key aspect of what is distinctive Jewish practice. Strict Sabbath observance, which even appears to be taken on in Jesus, and so forth. Do you see any equivalent movement of a systematic attack on Torah outside of Christianity?
Well, Philo mentions other Alexandrian Jews who agreed with him that the laws had to be interpreted spiritually.
Right.
But Philo said, of course, we still got to obey him. But these people didn't. They said, look, we know the real point now. Why go through the charade any longer? That's very much like in Colossians, that the Torah was the charade telling you what would happen. And Philo said, no way. We have to keep actually doing it. Okay, we understand why now, but we're doing it. So he knew of liberal Jews who didn't want to bother with the externals.
Right. Josephus even tells us there was a sort of an anti-circumcision rabbi who was working at the court of Adiabene.
Oh, wow. Oh, is this... Yeah, this guy
Ananias.
Yeah, he told Isaetes that you might not really want to get circumcised.
Right, you don't really need to.
You're going to think this is.
But the king doesn't end up getting circumcised. Another rabbi has an influence on him, so he ends up doing it.
I have to ask, though, this is a great part of me asking this, because this goes, I like the whole top down, bottom up, right? Going back to the basics at the beginning, like, this is interesting. I suspect that a lot of this is ground up. Okay. And Dr. Price is explaining how this could be potentially a ground up thing, meaning it's got to,
right. Even all of it together. Right.
However, Dr. Price, does this mean that in your view that there's no top down relevance
No, I wouldn't say that. Like, in fact, you could look at these mentions of the centurion and the another one, and Cornelius is yet another one of these guys, and that the centurion is bankrolled a synagogue and so forth. That isn't necessarily just a comment on how Gentiles have faith that most Jews don't. You could take the Syrophoenician woman as another example of that, but she has no power. But the centurion does, and he's a Roman, and so is Cornelius, who is a Jesus fan, etc. They could kind of represent Christian friendly. Well, look at what Paul says, that Erastus, the city treasurer, and the household of Caesar, and so on.
Yeah.
That means that there were Roman officials who were Christian or pro-Christian,
Right.
And so they could have exerted.
It may even be more than that. In Philippians, he says he has full access to the Imperial Guard. That no one in the Imperial Guard hasn't heard the message. So well am I doing here in Rome. And he may even be referring to a freedman of Nero, Epaphroditus, who we know may be the same guy who was associated with Josephus, a high-ranking Jew working for emperors. That would place his contacts very high up. The Book of Acts, I don't trust much of the Book of Acts. It's certainly not history.
What do you mean?
But at least the tradition we get there from Paul's mission is that invariably his foes were Jews who apparently don't like his Torah critical approach or his new teachings on Jesus, whatever. And it's Jews who are always attacking Paul everywhere he goes. And invariably it's Roman officials that are constantly protecting Paul. If that tradition is even vaguely based on early Christian missionary tradition, the Romans are actively helping it.
Yeah.
In some respect. Sorry, Dr. Bob.
And you can see why. I mean, there's also a logic here. Being so pro-peace, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, submit to the evildoer, love your enemy.
So James, this is great. Let me ask you this. This is perfect point. Okay. I could see where the roads meet. Everything could have naturally developed, okay, using the components that Dr. Bob is explaining. However, it was just the pretty enough picture that, well, damn, we Romans agree with this.
Put it together the way I do is all of these changes seem to be sweeping and simultaneous and imposed on the same thing. That is to say, you could imagine the Torah orthodoxy fading away. There would at least be some minority school of it. You could imagine some natural criticism of us collectively and what we got wrong. Now, getting the whole concept of Messiah as an earthly political leader seems to me a distinct elbow. Maybe one I should ask Dr. Price about. Do you think that could have been a natural development? That is to say, the total reformation within of what it even means to be the Jewish Messiah.
Back up one sentence. Say that part again. It broke out. I'm sorry.
Does Dr. Bob think that aspect of the great elbow could be an organic development within Judaism?
Well, I think as a reaction to the messianic catastrophes in 70 and 135 or 6, whatever it was, just as the rabbi said, let's just drop this apocalyptic dating business for the same reasons. That would make sense to me. If
so
you
never again expect an earthly Messiah?
Or let's leave it to God. Maybe he's on earth
my
already.
kingdom is not of this earth.
Well, that sounds like Stoicism.
Yeah, it sure sounds like pagan philosophy. Sure sounds like Stoicism or Platonism is changing the way they're looking. Look, it's often another dimension where the Messiah has really got his business.
So that
do you think that would be an organic, non-pagan influence to?
It could be. I mean, this is certainly something Romans would be happy about and would want to foster. And it does seem like somebody is the gospel writers are bending over backwards to say, hey, Romans, look at this. See, Paul declared innocent, Jesus declared innocent by Romans, mind you, and so forth. Even by a revolutionary, one of the lesti on the cross. And it just seems a bit much and with Pilate. So you're telling me you are a king? And he says, oh, well, yeah, I am. That's why I've come to bear witness to the truth. I'm a stoic king.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it would. So that does make me wonder if there's some kind of arm twisting going on. And as I say, what you came up with about the Flavian emblem, what does that mean? Nothing? I mean, you
well,
have to have...
very first, what strikes me is that our earliest means of identifying the first evidence of physically, first evidence of Christian presence are the catacombs. The oldest being the catacombs of Domitilla, who could be a Flavian Imperial. But on the surface of it, the very reason why we identify it as a Flavian site is the anchor and fish, because it was Titus's symbol, a Flavian symbol. The very symbol that we also use it in its earliest parts to identify as Christian, because the anchors and the fish were used as the most common symbolization of Jesus until the 4th century. Really, if you can do the comparison, the anchors attended by fish or with a fish on it are by far the more common way of symbolizing Jesus in the catacombs than the cross, until we get to about the time of Constantine. And, it's funny because Clement of Alexandria even tells us that, yes, these are the seals, the symbols, the visual symbols we Christians use. He includes symbols associated with Apollo, like a lyre, associated with pagan gods, like a dove, but then tells us that the anchor and fish we get from the Seleucids. Even Christian Clement of Alexandria admits that the origin of the Christian symbol of the anchor comes from this pagan Seleucid source who was tying himself to Apollo or Serapis in the process. And so if early Christians, I mean, by the end of the 2nd century, Christians are admitting, it's a pagan and origin thing. In fact, there's no question that Titus, the Roman emperor who claimed to be a Jewish Messiah and who was the first Roman emperor to use that, and almost only Roman emperor to use this symbol, he must have gotten it from the Seleucids. It's an Eastern a symbol, and the anchor itself had been picked up on Jewish coinage, not to represent the Messiah. That would typically be represented by stars in Jewish coinage. But the anchor was sort of picked up as a Seleucid symbol, even in Jewish coinage. So it made a perfect pickup for Titus. In other words, it is because it's connected to the East and used in Jewish coins that Titus is using it. But given the dolphin wrapped around the anchor, the precedent for that are the Seleucid kings themselves.
Did Titus claim to be the Messiah? I know Johanan ben Zakkai and Josephus both said that he was, but did he also?
Johanan ben Zakkai and Josephus both claimed that Vespasian was, and when Josephus is writing, he may not be aware of the Titus claim. Tacitus and Suetonius both point blank in the early 2nd century. They don't say that they claim to be the messiahs. They say they were the messiahs. And for pagan Romans to be saying that, and then of course they, go on to kind of explain that. Look, the Julius Caesar statue turned to the east. That's where it's going on. And look, they did come to rule the world from Judea, which is obviously what the Hebrew prophecies are pointing to. So given that explanation by both Suetonius and Tacitus, who include both Vespasian and Titus, it seems to me that it's an important part of the Flavian imperial cult. I don't think we can deny, given the fact that point blank pagan Romans in the early 2nd century are saying they were, both Vespasian and Titus were the Jewish messiahs, that was a part of their propaganda.
I didn't catch that in reading Creating Christ. I'm sure you must have mentioned it, but my senile noggin.
We jammed so much in there, it's a little easy to figure out. No, it's quite apparent that being the Jewish Messiah was part of the Flavian imperial cult. When you read these pagans like Vespasian's biography of Suetonius, Suetonius' biography of Vespasian, it's astonishing how many different Eastern Mediterranean religions are being folded into the imperial cult. Venus, Aphrodite on the island of Cyprus gives them thumbs up, positive. The Samaritans at Carmel are giving to Vespasian the thumbs up. Vespasian is performing healing miracles identical to the healing miracles that described of Jesus in the Gospels at the temple of Serapis, this healing resurrected Osiris type god in Alexandria. Vespasian is further identifying himself with Serapis by putting his face on one side of coins and Serapis is on the other side. He is the new Serapis. He's healing in Alexandria at the Serapeum. So we know that the Imperials, we knew previously, for example, Augustus identified himself with Apollo. There's that strange story of his mother being impregnated at the temple of Apollo. We know that Julius Caesar claimed to be the descendant of Venus, and both of them used that in their propaganda. They were integrating themselves with these Greek pagan gods. It's clear Vespasian is broadening it even further. I am Serapis. I am the Jewish Messiah. So both Egyptian and Jewish titles are being layered into clearly what is the imperial cult.
And
I'd
Bob,
just be fascinated to understand what that cult really all involved.
That's what I'm saying. Like Dr. Bob, this whole package of the New Testament, especially if you start to see that Matthew's earlier and stuff, it seems like the perfect package to pitch to someone like Vespasian, and have the Jewish leadership say, hey, check out the religion. It honors you. It's respectful of the Romans. I mean, scratch the book of Revelation, which made it into the canon later on. Like these specific Hellenistic writings that are clearly borrowing Homeric epics, the Odyssey, the Iliad. They're making this Jesus figure better than the Odysseus character, and he's paying homage to you. He's got a Roman centurion with better faith or whatever, I'm just giving you an example. Like, it seems like even if it was ground up, it's a perfect pitch to say, this has no quarrels with you. In fact, give us the thumbs up.
It's sort of retooling itself to different audiences too. Mark was unsatisfactory. So to a more Jewish audience, we're not going to come out and say you have to worship the emperor as a god. I don't know. We understand that would be terrible. And we don't want to offend your Torah quite as much as Paul and Mark did. But then, of course, Luke gets his hands on the same material. Oh, that's too Jewish. No, we need to kind of address ourselves to a more universal, potentially Gentile audience. What the heck? The same exact message is being retooled for entirely different audiences within a generation. I find that an interesting fact by itself as well.
Yeah. About Paul, when I'm with Jews, I behave like a Jew. When I'm with Gentiles, like
all things to all people, so we can get as many as possible.
So you got to ask, were the Ebionites correct that Paul was not actually a Jew? I mean, it sort of leaves that open. What does Paul mean exactly? He behaves as if a Jew, like in Acts 21 or whatever it is, where he goes to the temple and there's a riot, and but he tries to ward that off with the paying for the guy's vows and all that stuff. Jeez.
Yeah.
So much we don't know.
That's the thing. It's like what James's strength on creating Christ, and I'd like to have you maybe critically analyze this, is his political aspects that he's presenting. It's clear that this is Hellenism on steroids, in my opinion. The New Testament isn't just taking a Hellenistic approach. We see Philo saying, look, yes, Torah still needs to be observed, you super spiritualist, okay? But it does have that deeper dynamic of spiritual truth to it. We understand, yes, but you need to be balanced. You need to come back and kind of do both. Well, Matthew's probably doing that. Matthew's saying both. Okay, we need to do both. But the other guys are going super spiritual. Okay, that's cool. But is it going super spiritual to a point where now we're incorporating a Gentile mission, to a point where we're now sucking in people who are never needing to join the first covenant to begin with? You don't even have to.
That brings up another great. That's a great question, but another great question.
Go
if
ahead.
we see Paul as the author of this Torah criticism, if we see Paul as the one presenting a new version of who Jesus is, it didn't come from his Gentile audience, which is where you'd think some of this stuff would come from. It's coming from Paul. And Paul's saying, see how I'm appealing to you Gentiles now with all this stuff. I'm not so pro-Torah. I'm open to a semi-divine Savior God. And in that way, Paul's kicking open the door for the Gentiles. It's not the Gentiles first infiltrating and saying, oh no, we want to incorporate a man God or Torah critical elements. It's Paul with his revelation saying no. And that's why I can now preach to Gentiles.
Yeah, I always, nor am I the first to see this, but it dawned on me relatively recently that with Paul preaching what to the Gentiles, that Jesus is the Messiah, what is the selling point in a non-Jewish environment? It's as if, I got big news. Did you hear so-and-so is the new Prince of Liechtenstein? What do I care?
And there's some really cool stories about the new Prince of Liechtenstein.
Yeah, it just seems to me something. I'm working on the final section of Judaizing Jesus, where I'm going to get into this and try to explain why the heck the Pauline Simonian gospel is completely different from that of the Jerusalem Qumran church, and how and why they eventually got together for a while. It's a
What's
big.
What's fascinating is that we have Paul apparently infiltrating, right? A Jewish Christian movement of sorts that's Torah Orthodox, may have a different conception of the Messiah than he does, and that stuff isn't going down well. He's actually, another thing that strikes me as odd is, what the heck is he doing? It's rather than going off and doing his own thing, he's saying, no, I'm part of mainline Jewish messianic thinking. I'm part of James's movement, right? But it's these guys that are hypocrites about the law. It's these guys who are spying out these guys don't appreciate the revolution of Christ Jesus' death and resurrection. Let me explain that to you.
He's Marcion.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We'll see whether it goes back to Simon Magus' argument about the law, or whether it's just Marcion in the early 2nd century doing this. In either case, it still strikes me as we're not waiting for Gentiles to tell us what they want. It seems to me that Paul is opening up a Gentile mission on purpose. And it's not his new Gentile converts who are going to come in and say, oh, well, we want changes to Torah. We want a sort of a mystery cult man God. And it's Paul giving it to him on a platter.
Yeah,
and that's what's opening up this big Gentile movement.
That's the problem. Like, one of the problems is, if we take at face value what Paul's saying in his letters, Paul is literally saying that these guys that he's arguing against are trying to dupe his own audience. So it tells me whoever Paul's arguing against, they're on a mission to try and get Paul's guys. That tells me, if the recent rebuttal, for example, that Dr. Carrier did, for example, with the whole IO thing, trying to expound on what was going on, he says that Paul is, in essence, tearing down any requirements for becoming a Jew in order to join the first covenant. And so what we have is someone who's saying, don't worry about any of these stipulations. You can become on equal playing ground as a Jew just by having faith in this figure called Jesus Christ. Whereas, according to Paul, according to Dr. Carrier, he says Paul's audience believes they had to become a Jew in order to join the covenant. So they can't become a Christian.
What's all this business about adoptive sons of Abraham or spiritual circumcision? Yeah, Paul is saying this is a way to join Israel, even though you don't have to obey the Mosaic law. Forget circumcision and kosher diet. You can be a member. You can be adopted in. You can be a spiritual descendant of Abraham, spiritually circumcised. You see, what's the point of all that if he's not doing that?
Yeah, he did talk about being spiritually crucified. I'm crucified to the world, and the world.
Right. Pick up your own cross, whatever that is.
That's strange. Huh, Dr. Price, what do you think about this theory? What do you think? Do you think that we could talk about more of if there's possible Roman influence on this? I mean, we know that they start to adopt this practice this religion becomes, I mean, at least it appears that high up ranking people, their family members start becoming a Christian.
Curiously, Pliny the Younger, in his letter to Trajan, around 111 AD, indicates that there was a fad in Christianity that involved all classes of Romans, he says, and that it reached its peak about 20 years before he's writing, which is smack dab in the middle of the Flavian dynasty. But it's clear also that while Pliny is telling us that there are all kinds of Gentile Christians by the beginning of the first century, and a growing number, they sort of reached their peak under the Flavians. But it's also clear that people like Tacitus, Suetonius, and probably Pliny are confused about what a Christian is. And so Pliny needs to ask the emperor, what do I do if someone claims to be a Christian? Is it the name alone that should do it? And what I've been doing is saying, can you say a prayer for the emperor in the presence of his image? Now, you don't have to pray to the image. And Jews, you see, would not be able to do that and had been sort of exempted from that. But it's not clear to me that all Christians would have been able to fail that, would have had to fail that test. I mean, if there were imperial Christians in the Flavian family, like Titus Flavius Clemens and his wife Domitilla, they surely must have been involved in traditional Roman work. In fact, if we have evidence of Roman Christians in the Roman army in the 2nd century, they must have been able to take oaths under standards, images of golden eagles, and been participated in rituals that would have been offensive to Orthodox Jews at the time. So it's not clear to me that that Pliny is doing any more than separating out one kind of Christian from another, because Romans are conflating Jewish rebels and, in fact, all kinds of Jewish messianics under the same rubric.
Dr. Price, this reminds me of something with what James is saying here. You know how the Jews write in their scriptures, don't do this, don't do that. But what was really being practiced isn't what they're saying not to do. Just like Paul saying, don't worship these idols. Why are you saying that, Paul? Because they're doing the thing that they're not supposed to do. So technically, we can't get too literal and say, well, they would never have worshipped Caesar. What are you talking about? Are you kidding me? They were human beings who may have joined the cult of Christianity.
Take the reference, Cassius Dio's reference to Clement, and we combine that with Suetonius's. Here we have a nephew of Vespasian, a cousin of Titus. He's married a niece of Titus in Domitian, a granddaughter of Vespasian, and he is being expelled for adopting Jewish ways. Now, his family had just fought the Jewish war. They were the Roman generals who had sacked Jerusalem. And now he, a close member of the imperial family, is adopting Jewish ways. What sort of Jewish ways is this Roman family that's so hated by rebel Jews that he's worshiping? He must have been able to both participate in Roman civic life, that means praying before an image of an emperor, and been Jewish in some way, adopting Jewish practices. What a paradoxical thing that is. And there's a perfectly pagan Roman of a high rank who in some way is becoming Jewish, but is still able to compromise with the establishment.
Well,
what do you think, God-fear?
What about the Emperor Constantine a little later in the day, who is both the head of the church and the Pontifex Maximus of the invincible son? He must not have thought there was anything untoward about that.
That is really a fascinating one, right?
So the arguments that people make, James, saying, well, the Christianity was nothing. It was this weird, strange, just cult that was this Jewish thing only, like very few Gentiles bought into it, doesn't necessarily, I mean, if we take Paul at his, what he's saying and the way that they present it, of course, it might be hyped because it's in fictional writings like Acts, like the world's being turned upside down. I think that a Gentile audience would really like what they're hearing. Look, we can eat what we want. We don't have to cut our peckers. There's good moral values, very stoic concepts, very Hellenized.
You could find elements of cynic philosophy, stoic philosophy, Platonic philosophy, all over either the sayings of Jesus or the basic structure of the theology.
And it's not intellectually stupid. It's stimulating. It's especially the Gospels. Look, guys, they're using Dionysus and Euripides the Bacchae, and they're making a epic out of this story that I don't think the Jews only took to heart. I think the Roman wars also had a huge impact on Roman life.
Yes.
So this would have hit a heart on both sides of the fence. It's not just the Jews. The Romans would have saw this and said, wow, I mean, this is true. Like, look what happened.
The
And
Romans
of course
wanted to worship just as many foreign gods as they could. And by the time of the first century, they probably want to syncretize it in with as many other deities as they could. You know, we show in Creating Christ this wonderful first century image from Rome, a statue of a deity that combines like the images and the symbols of 6 different Egyptian and Greek deities all into one, like an all god syncretism. And if you see sort of the direction the imperial cult particularly is taking, we're going to identify with Apollo and Venus, and we're going to identify with Serapis, the Jewish Messiah. By the end of the first century, the syncretism involved in just the imperial cult was a breathtaking one. If one sees Christianity as that kind of a syncretism, that's in effect intentionally making it Jesus as consistent as possible with Serapis and all these mystery gods, then again we have a sort of paradoxical thing happening among messianic Jews, and a rather sophisticated integration in the New Testament literature with Hebrew theology and history. That's a very sophisticated thing. And while I do see that each of these elements, at least each of these elements may have had a perfectly organic, straight through development, all of them occurring all at the same time, sweeping simultaneous all at once in this sophisticated form that's integrating Jewish Hebrew scripture in such detail, almost linguistically even, and rendering it consistent in so many ways with these mystery cults like Serapis or something. That is a very sophisticated thing. And that is a very, taking on all these different elements at once. So you're changing Messianic Judaism in several important ways all at once, adding these pagan elements, it seems, or at least making it consistent with those pagan elements all at once. For that development to have happened, say, between the middle of the first century and the middle of the second, all of that to happen between the middle of the first century and the middle of the second century seems to me like a breathtaking revolution within Messianic Judaism that needs explanation.
In Anthony Wallace's discussion of revitalization movements, he's talking about like Borneo and various places during modern colonial times, with Europeans coming in to mine the place and sell stuff and all that. They the Melanesian cargo cults and so forth. He says that that historically, if a colonial imperial power kicks the butt of the native culture, they must have been praying to their gods to turn back these invaders and opponents and all that, and it didn't work. So they would either adopt the religion of the invaders, or they would claim it was theirs all along and was appropriated by the colonizers, in which case they would take elements from it and put it into their system. Like one or more of the cargo cults said that that salvation will come when Jesus pilots a great ship laden with Western goodies for us. And African groups said, the Bible that these missionaries have, that was originally ours, but they have rewritten it and so on. So you figure, look, it's obvious who's in charge here. Their gods are stronger than ours, so we better learn to beat them at their own game. Well, why would this not happen with Jews who were terribly defeated by the Romans and adjacent to all these other cultural and religious influences?
Would it have had that kind of sophisticated response that we see in the Gospels? That is a highly intellectualized response, like I say, drawing on previous Hebrew and probably classical literature and religious ideas. Seems to be a very sophisticated Christian literature, early Christian literature seems a very sophisticated response that way.
Well, they were the gospel and epistle writers were apparently pretty well educated. And if the most early Christians were peasants, they didn't include the writers, and they must have been scribes or whatever. And they were already in the business of applying ancient myths and texts and all of that. And as Derek pointed out, they certainly, as educated men, must have known about Homer and Euripides. Everybody did.
Yeah.
Grade school kids did.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's not too hard to imagine that they would assimilate the stuff. I mean, Jewish assimilation to the Hellenistic culture was a big theme and a big temptation all over the place. That's why there were people like the Zealots.
Since at least the Maccabees are before, right?
Yeah. They said we gotta draw a line here, folks.
So, right. Dr. Bob, go ahead, James.
Well, I was just going to say that when we're looking at some people like Philo and Josephus, though, we are looking at Roman cooperating aristocrats,
right? Yeah.
Wealthy Romans. I mean, your educated Roman is typically going to be wealthy. And in that context, probably means he's doing business with the Roman or Hellenistic world. And that would tend to say that they also, and you can really hear it both in Philo and Josephus, they are pro-Roman. They are seeking peace with Rome. Josephus goes so far as to say God's gone over to the Roman side. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that kind of a sophisticated response from highly educated people is likely to come from people with a pro-Roman political orientation anyway, people who in fact were connected to Roman politicians. Josephus directly. Philo was related to the famous family of oligarchs, tax collectors working with the Romans in Alexandria to collect Roman taxes. So in the cases of both, say, Philo and Josephus, as educated Jews go, being wealthy, educated Jews sort of implies a pro-Roman politics and a cooperation with the Roman government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, how many anti-Roman Sadducees were there? Probably a lot.
So, Doc, let me ask you something in that vein, though, that James said, because it's a great point. We know that Luke and Acts, or at least Luke for sure, maybe Acts for sure, with his whole shipwreck scenario, is borrowing from Josephus. So whoever this is, they've got access to some writings.
There seems to be so many either story references taken from Josephus, or even some linguistic dependency. The road to Emmaus scene may echo Josephus, but more than that, he's got the Jesus is a remarkable bar mitzvah. He's got shipwreck in Acts. There seems to be Luke Acts seems to have a number of echoes to antiquities, and some scholars have said that shows a dependence of Luke Acts on antiquities.
And that's a good question to ask for you, Dr. Bob. To spin the question I'd like to ask on behalf of James here would be, you're not saying that and James isn't saying that this requires the Roman signature of the Caesar himself saying, all right, Christianity, no. But what he is saying is that it seems like as you develop, the story develops in the New Testament, if you will, progressively in the way that critical scholars have. If we just go with the consensus on Paul, just going with that. But either way, we take this chronological order. We see the latest development in the New Testament, the 2020 example, or 2021, since we're about to enter into 2021 example. The latest stories that we find in the epistles and what's going on is that what we have is someone, not saying it's Josephus himself, I'm saying other possible high up people, educated people who are connected in the Roman Empire are going, we're getting far away from this John the Baptist type sect. We are divorcing ourselves from the original types of these people, and we are all the way on this side that's going to get along with Rome, forget about the doomsday event, not focus on these things, and get along with Rome. And it's so much so that it's succeeded so well, it becomes eventually the Roman religion. It's like, so I'm not saying it's full-fledged Roman to the point where Titus and, all right, we're going to sign this thing. We can't prove that. That's speculative.
Well, let me go further, though.
Okay.
If it is people like, not Philo, he's too early for this, but if it is people of that type, like and again, I'm not saying Josephus wrote any of the Gospels, but if it is of that type of guy who's behind this, a pro-Roman Jew, sophisticated, educated, trying to create a form of messianic Judaism that is not militarily hostile to the world around them, wouldn't he seek? Wouldn't he be have Rome? And how much of his activities could go on without getting his friends' approval? He'd want the Roman state approval, and he would probably be able to get it.
Luke sounds like he's writing to someone of great importance.
Yeah, I mean, that is to say, a wealthy, educated, pro-Roman Jew has probably got support from the Roman government in this age of rebellion.
What do you think, Dr. Bob?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to prove, but so is everything. It's all probability, and that seems both plausible and probable.
So your omniscience is saying yes? No, I'm just kidding. Oh, goodness. James, you got one more.
That Dr. Bob is really helping me here a great deal.
Right.
Each of these elements that Christianity is bringing to bear either was developing organically within Judaism on its own, or could well have been based on an organic development that could have happened within Rome. And the real censure, if there's going to be evidence that pushes us over into the probable, it's going to be these specific connections. What kind of connections does Rome have? What does Paul say he has? What kind of connections can explain this? Yeah. Like the physical evidence, like the anchor and fish symbol.
Yeah,
or something,
I wanted to come back to that to say that you have to turn the argument around on the people that want to just wave that away. If they don't think that the use of Flavian imagery means there was Flavian sponsorship or what, then what is the explanation? I mean, it'd be helpful if they could explain, oh, you don't need to resort to that, this is the reason. But does anybody have one? I doubt it.
I have asked, in effect, a worse paraphrase, but I have asked, in effect, that question in various forms of various people, and I never get an answer. Because it just sort of sits there, We have an empire-wide problem with the Jewish war, don't we? It's not just in Judea and Galilee. We have disturbances in Alexandria. Philo has to go talk to Caligula about. We have Claudius expelling all of the Jews of Rome because of disturbances caused by someone named Chrestus. So we have all over the Eastern Mediterranean an ideological problem confronting the Romans, which I think sort of needed an ideological response. The Romans were well aware that it was the religion, messianic prophecy. They said so point blank. It was their messianic prophecies that most caused the rebellion. So say Tacitus, and Josephus, and Suetonius. So they were acutely aware that it was the messianic prophecies that needed to be addressed and that they needed an empire-wide solution. When we hear, I don't believe Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, but let's say it's even let's say it's in the middle of the 2nd century that people are saying, we need a bishop on every district in the island of Crete. Wow, that strikes me as very unlikely or implausible unless the Roman state is aware and approving of what they're doing. I don't trust Eusebius either, but he says that when Hadrian conquered Jerusalem in the 2nd Jewish rebellion around in the 130s, Eusebius says this: he expels the Jews from Judea after the 2nd Jewish War, but appoints Christian bishops in Jerusalem. What?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So James, this is interesting, and I'd like to get your comments on this, Dr. Price. It sounds to me that we are told this view is an idiotic view from some, right? Some say this is ridiculous. And we are practically told that Rome sat by idly, allowing messianic stuff like this to take place. And then when it got out of hand, they just said, well, grab your clubs and swords, let's just go kill them. Like, they didn't proactively try to attempt to adopt, manipulate, in some way involve themselves ideologically. It's like us going and fighting the Taliban. Okay, are we just going to sit back and let their prophecies continue to brew in their brains and corrupt and poison their mindset to a point where we're the enemy and they're going to keep trying to attack us and over and over and over? Or at some point, do you think America, especially if we were actually practicing what other empires like you mentioned did, Persia and other empires, Greece, etc., saw and said, okay, we know that ideologies can poison people's minds. And in order to, for example, Assyria, in order to keep uprisings happen, let's transplant some of these Sumerians into Assyria and Assyrians into Samaria and start blending people and ideas and stuff like that.
The Assyrians
act
were
like
really
there's
clever. They probably eliminated the captured Israelites, because from what we know, the Assyrians knew how to divide them up into little segments and all that.
It makes me wonder, though, in light of Rome, are we to stand by and act like Rome didn't do any of this? Like, Rome, just this little backwater Jewish cult. It always was a backwater Jewish cult. It remained just a Jewish cult, and it organically on its own developed into this empire religion. Where did Rome come in? Where did sophisticated aristocrats and leaders in the political parties say, that's it, I like this thing, we're running with this? What happened? Is this supposed to be a 3rd, 4th century when really Christianity gets any involvement, or is it prior? And that's what I like what James is trying to do. He's trying to say, I think it was prior. I don't think it took 3 centuries for Rome to see this thing and see this is important. There's something good about this, because it does take the fangs.
It's not just the peace message and love your enemies and turn the other cheek. It's pay your taxes. Jesus befriends tax collectors.
And he tells you it's no compromise to pay Roman taxes.
Right. No, in fact, the render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and God that which is God. Give back to God what's God's, and give back to Caesar what's Caesar's, to simply translate it. Yeah. That is a direct argument against the rebels, isn't it? That is what the rebels don't think is possible. You can't be a good Jew and a Roman citizen. Jesus is saying, no, you can render unto both. Give them back what's theirs. That's all it takes.
You can't use that money in the temple to buy sacrifices anyway. Right. So how could God begrudge it to Caesar?
Right. And so much of what Jesus seems to be saying in the Gospels is a direct and dire warning against rebellion that's being, I don't think that Mark 13 could have been composed before 70 AD. I know there are other scholars who put it a little before that, but come. The details are too rich, too fine. He knows that the temple won't have a stone left on top of each other. He knows that there'll be armies seen in the clouds, just as Josephus describes. The Josephus description and Mark 13 is too identical, in my view, not to have been written after the event. And if that's so, then what they've done is they've composed a warning against rebellion and put it into the mouth of Jesus 40 years earlier. And that strikes again, okay. Or even when Peter cuts off the ear at the arrest and Jesus does the healing and say, hey, whoever uses the sword shall die by the sword. Literally, that's nonsense. A lot of people who use weapons or initiate force die of natural causes. But in the context of the 1st century, it makes perfect sense as a dire warning. Don't rebel. Again, it seems to be transposing into Jesus an awareness that of how the Jewish war will go down, and that Jesus making a dire warning, don't do it.
Yeah, why didn't he say that to the Roman? I mean, obviously the Roman didn't cut Peter's ear off, but it's funny how he has a Jew. He's telling a Jew, a disciple, a knucklehead, hey, you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. Hint, hint, we've been dying by the sword a lot. Let's stop dying by the sword. You know what I mean? Like, that's a common sense to me. But I know I'm reading a little bit into it. But guys, I'm taking assumptions, but is it ridiculous? That sounds common sense to me, even though I can't be certain about some of these places. We're dealing with text, ancient text in antiquity and probabilities and stuff. But guys, that sounds common sense in light of the real issue in the air that it's claiming to be a part of. So anyway, I'm boring you, Bob. I'm boring you.
I'm just a bit sleepy.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, it does make sense. what is probable, given the circumstances, there's no reason to assume that something natural like that didn't happen just because you can't exactly prove it did. We make such judgments on a lot of other things when we say, well, Jews wouldn't have gone along with this because we know enough about them, even though it's not mentioned what they thought specifically about so-and-so. You can draw inferences sometimes. Like we could be pretty sure that Jews would not have volunteered to worship Caesar. I mean, it's conceivable somebody did, but based on what we know, it's a pretty safe bet that almost nobody would have.
Right, right. Most Jews certainly could not, and they were given exemptions, especially before the war, from doing any such thing. Christians, especially newly converted Gentile Christians, would present at least a problem that way. But as I say, I'm not sure it's clear that second century Christians, Gentile Christians, couldn't pray before an image. I mean, they had graven images. We can see them they were violating the Ten Commandments left and right with idols and graven images representing God. So it's not clear to me that early Christians, at least some Gentile early Christians, weren't able to make sacrifices before an image or something. I'm not sure what the varieties, and that's the other thing. We really aren't aware of the variety of Christian practice, right, in the second century. It sounds to me like there was a wide range of Christian practice in the second century.
How could you control it if you wanted to?
Right. And it seems to me the Romans would want to incur, even if, let me put it this way, even if the message of peace was perfectly organic, seems like a very extreme message of peace that involves centurions and tax paying, which is ominously political for the time. But nonetheless, even if we can imagine a philosophy of peace emerging among Messianic Jews, it seems to me a message that the Romans would have surely, had they heard of it, picked up, used it, and wanted to promote it. It's hard for me to imagine them not hearing about Paul and Mark and John and saying, hey, this has got a lot of good stuff in here for us. This is really going to help pacify. If we can get that version of Messianic Judaism sold, and if they can buy Paul and Mark and John, we're not going to have a problem with these Jews anymore. We'll pacify them, particularly the Messianic ones. So if the Romans had in any way known of New Testament Christianity, it's hard for me not to imagine them at least surreptitiously embracing it and supporting it.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world to me. It's unfortunate that, like in this book, Operation Messiah, by a couple of people whose names I can't pronounce.
Voskulin and Sheldon.
What is it? How do you say
Theus Voskulin and Rosemary Sheldon.
Yeah. They sort of make it sound like a conspiracy theory that Paul, this double agent, to put it that way. I mean, that automatically sounds kind of wacky, but it what the saying really isn't. It's just like the same political sensibilities the Sadducees had. I mean, and they were upfront
without him being hired by a Roman state agent, he could still have had this thing. And Romans would have, of course, implicitly supported it had they, to the extent they heard of it. Yeah. So, in other words, the tradition in Acts or the tradition in Philippians makes good sense, right? In the sense that Romans, even if he wasn't on the Roman payroll from the start, Romans, once they heard of it, would have said, "Yeah, let's protect that guy. Let's help calm these Jews down who are so hostile against Paul."
Especially if it's not just a polite debate, but as Acts portrays, rioting. Naturally, they're going to want to say, "Oh, wait a minute, let's hold on."
On the other hand, Operation Messiah, well, and another criticism I would have of it, it takes too much of Acts as history, as literal. I don't buy most of the history in Acts. So much of Acts is just contradicts Josephus and common sense and what we know. So I don't really think of Acts as anything but fictionalized history. They seem to accept Acts as more historical than I ever would. On the other hand, the tradition that Acts embodies and preserves and transmits is that Roman state officials were actively helping Paul throughout his Mediterranean missions.
Like when Old Testament scholars say that Moses seeing the burning bush, well, that's not as wacky as it sounds, because people still see this kind of thing. Is it ball lightning or what? And maybe that's what happened there. Well, they're not signing on to say this actually happened, but rather this is why the story has a degree of verisimilitude. And that's if the ancients knew that nothing like that had happened, they said, what the heck, you got Romans protecting Paul? I mean, it must have made sense to them whether these particular cases happened or not.
Yeah.
Well, James, do you have anything you'd like?
Let me just try and, I'm almost, it's scary for maybe to ask, would you say then that the idea that the Romans at least supported the promotion of Christianity in the first 2 centuries is not, or is it, would you think it even probable?
Yeah. There's all kinds of nonsense from some politically leftist New Testament scholars today to say, oh yeah, the Gospels and the epistles are all against right-wing Roman imperialism and voting for Donald Trump, and it's just ventriloquism. It seems to me it's just the opposite, and since this kind of character there's more than one of them in the New Testament. And so it makes a lot of sense to me. And plus, the Operation Messiah, I don't mean to write that off. There's some really interesting insights in that. It's just that I kind of wish they hadn't, like with Joe Atwell, a brilliant guy.
Right.
He says certain things that he needn't say that makes the whole thing
go too far than they need to. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. So at least in the most mild form, you think a sort of Roman provenance is probable.
In fact, this thing with Vespasian and Titus being messiahs, and not only in the idea of Jews who would say anything to get out of being killed, but by Romans, this is very important to me in terms of what is the synoptic apocalypse predicting. It certainly seems to identify the fall of the city in 70 with something that happened. And if these guys were the Messiah, maybe that's the sign.
We should have a glorious coming of a Son of Man in association with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem within the lifetime of some of his hearers, according to Jesus himself in the Synoptics. If that is not a mistake, then it can only be pointing to the Flavians.
Yeah.
In terms of the timing. And that is very odd indeed. It would even be odd to associate the glorious coming of at least a glorious coming of a Son of Man with the destruction of Jerusalem. Yeah. Here we are, we're failed in all our traditional messianic hopes, but that's the moment when we get a glorious coming of a Son of Man. Whoa.
Yeah, this has really made me reconsider things.
Wow.
Fascinating.
Thank you, though, Dr. Price. You've given me a lot of good stuff to think about and work on.
I have to say, this was a wonderful conversation. One of the most civil conversations I've had on this channel in terms of this kind of dialogue, especially with a, how do I put this, controversial topic, because many people are just, nope. And they divorce the idea from their thought because they lump some of maybe Joseph Atwell's ideas that they don't agree with, or they think there's conspiracy or something, like it's like this bogus idea. But the way you described it today, James and Dr. Bob, is there's a natural explanation, even the natural explanation of a top-down involvement, because because I mean, look, if you see it and they say, hey, I can endorse this, okay, that you could say that's a natural explanation, that they saw some stuff and said, hey, even if all the elements were explained from a bottom up, and then the top down saw it and they said, yo, I can jump on this. I think this is fair. I like this idea. There can explain Roman provenance, and it can be a natural involvement from a top down view that doesn't require a crazy interjection to change everything. Hey, you might have this theory still be Roman provenance, but a natural way of explaining it. And that's amazing. So.
Exactly.
Another parallel that I think reveals the plausibility of it or reinforces it is Martin Luther with receiving the backing of the northern German princes, because why did they care about all the specific theological stuff? Luther was preaching the priesthood of the believers as a way of saying the Pope is not the only guy in charge. Each prince of his own principality should be the head of the church there. He's got every right to regulate the church. Well, they said, sounds good to me. And so...
Oh, yeah, no, the Landgrave of Hesse, or even Henry VIII, the King of England, both cite Romans 13 and say, hey, I don't need a pope. I'm kind of the pope in my own land.
Yeah. And so the politics of it leading to state backing of one among many religious preferences, that happens all the time.
Yeah. It's a regular occurrence.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So I guess the only thing everything had been explained and why things led up to stuff, but the only thing that becomes what you would say is an elbow, in my opinion, is the reaction to the war. So the war becomes that elbow, and it makes the Jews react, but also the Romans. And here we have, I think, a beautiful episode, you guys. I'm sure anyone watching this is amazed. Do you have any final things you'd like to say, James?
No, I agree. Thank you, Dr. Price, very much. Your
Thank you.
Insights and wisdom are always, always valuable.
As
Dr.
are yours,
Price.
Obviously, like with that book right behind you.
Seriously, though, that was a really, really interesting and educational, because it doesn't have to be either or. It could be both. And so that's what I've learned in this episode today. You guys, this is a great conversation. We need to have more of these. Thank you for making this possible, James. And Dr. Price, thank you for taking up the task to come on and talk about some of the criticisms of a strict, high top-down view of Roman provenance, because when you are strict, you're going to paint yourself in a corner. We don't have the evidence. I don't think. It's very circumstantial. And when I say circumstantial, I mean it's kind of like our buddies from Israel only using select scriptures to try
absent a Roman order or a letter saying, yeah, go get them, Christians.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here is much like Constantine backing the church. The question is, did something like this happen earlier too? Right. It's not like it's an unheard. What the Roman authorities backing and supporting Christianity? What? That's nonsense. Well, we know it happened in the 4th century. The question is, had it also happened in some form? That's no crazy notion.
Wow.
Wow.
I didn't.
Thank you. Fascinating conversation indeed.
I didn't expect Dr. Bob to say that, James. Did you?
No. In fact, he surprised me a couple of times today.
I think our good friends Kristen Whitaker Hood and a lot of people in the Roman Provenance room on Facebook will love to hear this. Guys, if you're on Facebook and you want to hear more from guys like James and Bob and everyone else that's involved in this communication, we have a group called Roman Provenance, and it's down here in the description. You guys can go join the Facebook group.
I'm active there almost every day, and I'm happy to answer any question from any comer on any aspect of the Roman provenance theory, or indeed the origins of Christianity.
And James is an admin in here, so he is in charge. He can make sure that you guys can join, everything's safe. And of course, if you're coming in through being a troll, I might get the authorities to promote my executing of you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing. And don't forget, guys, Dr. Bob's got the new book coming out soon. I can't wait to see what he has to say.
Oh, God, I can't wait for this book either.
This is Judaizing Jesus. He was going to have him circumcised, but he decided that's too much. We'll probably just Judaize Jesus.
I'm thinking that the cover will show like an old Albrecht Dürer type picture of Jesus, and photoshopped into it will be him holding the tablets of the law as if he's Moses.
Right. Oh, that's great. That is a great visual for the concept. Yeah.
Very, very nice. Well, thank you guys for joining me. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, go help my guest out, and you can help us out. Join the Patreon, get early access to all the videos. You guys, I can't thank you enough for sticking out this long and making MythVision possible, because this MythVision isn't just mine, it's yours. We are MythVision.